few years ago, I recorded a TikTok which was all about toxic siblings, and it was just an off-the-cuff video. It actually went viral, which I was not expecting at all. And there was so many comments, so many saves, and it just highlighted to me how much we don't talk about the trauma of toxic siblings. And so that is what has actually inspired this episode today. So I'm going to be talking about the dysfunctional patterns that is just not spoken about enough, especially when it comes to dysfunctional families and how that shows up and how that impacts our attachment styles. Because it's not just what happens with our parents, there's also the other relational dynamics as well. If you are part of a dysfunctional family system, of course, that's also going to show up in your sibling relationships as well, right? With that in mind, let's unpack. Welcome to Healing Childhood Trauma, the podcast for millennial women who are ready to heal from the past. Here, we have the deeper discussions on emotional well-being and practical tips that will empower you to transform your relationships and underlying anxiety from insecure to secure attachment. I'm Lizandra, your host and psychotherapist. I'm a little bit obsessed with human development, deep conversations, and finding the lesson even in the most challenging of circumstances. I'm very happy to have you with me on this journey of self-discovery where we unpack the past and heal in the present. So we're just going to unpack the dynamics of toxic siblings and what that looks like in dysfunctional families. But I want to be able to do that without judgment and without shame, because these kind of patterns are extremely common in all different types of families. No matter what culture or what background you're from, there are just certain dysfunctional patterns that sometimes we don't even have an awareness that it's dysfunctional until maybe we grow up and maybe we see more about other types of families and what that looks like, and recognizing that actually, some things in our family don't really look good, and I wouldn't really want anybody else to necessarily know about some of the things that happened within our family. And so sometimes you can kind of shut down around that and have this feeling of shame because you haven't really addressed dealing with some of these dysfunctional patterns. It's really confusing when you have a hard relationship with a sibling, because it's almost like we're supposed to have a close relationship with our siblings, right? And if we don't have that, then it just feels like something's wrong. But the reason why there can be this toxic dynamic with siblings is because it's representative of a larger issue of dysfunctional patterns in families. And it basically magnifies wider family trauma. But the thing is, there are reasons why we don't really talk about toxic family trauma or trauma within siblings. More often than not, it's actually minimized a lot of the time as, they're just being kids. Like, kids just, they say and do, the most silly things. You kind of minimize the impact of it because siblings are young, growing up, children. Depending on what culture you're from, there can be a lot of minimization because it's a sibling, and obviously we can't cut off contact with our siblings, or so we're told, depending again on what culture you're from. But there's this minimization of it's normal for siblings to fight, it's sibling rivalry, and so a lot of bullying behavior and problematic behavior gets minimized as something that is just a normal part of growing up and a normal part of childhood. In some respects, sometimes that can be the case. In other respects, in more of what I'll be kind of covering in this episode, is more of the dynamics that can lead to trauma and can further exacerbate harmful, narcissistic, abusive behavior, especially if that's what's already happening in the family. Because there can be this pressure for you to stay close because of the fact that you actually are siblings. And because you're siblings, you almost get a hall pass of, you're not going to cut them off and you have to be close. You have to have this relationship with your sibling because it's non-negotiable. And so that means that the boundaries almost get lowered, or there just isn't any boundaries. It's almost like because they're your sibling and because they're family, you don't have to set boundaries with them because you're bound together by blood, and blood basically overrides everything. And sometimes when families have that kind of mindset, it almost gives a hall pass to these behaviors. It enables the behaviors to not only to continue, but to go unrecognized and to just not acknowledge that actually it's a problem, and siblings, family or not, abusive behaviors just cannot be accepted and cannot be tolerated. And it doesn't make it okay just because you're family. If you wouldn't accept it from somebody else, there is this expectation that because they're family and because it's blood, you're just going to take it, you're just going to accept it because you don't have any choice. And sometimes that can be almost like the hive mind of the family, that it reminds me of, the Fast and the Furious of, we're family. Like no matter what happens, no matter what it is, it's ride or die. We keep it in the family, no matter what happens, no matter what you do, like you're locked in for life. And the difficulty with that is that sometimes when you're trying to set boundaries with family, it can feel like a betrayal, because why do you need to set boundaries with me? Like I'm your blood, I'm your family, like I should be everything to you. And so sometimes that mindset doesn't apply in, well, because we're family, maybe you should be nicer to me. Maybe you should treat me with more kindness, with more respect, because of that bond of us being family, as opposed to that gives you a hall pass to treat me negatively. And maybe you've heard this before, that just because it's your sibling, that you should just get over it and you should just be quick to forgive, no matter what it is, no matter what happens, no matter what the context is. It's always about forgiveness and not necessarily accountability. And there are toxic sibling behaviors that tend to just go unnoticed. Some very toxic behaviors that can be unnoticed or can go unnoticed and minimized are things around like making fun, for example. And it's often under the guise of, oh, it's just teasing or it's banter. And because of that, it's made out as though it's this small thing, as opposed to what it actually is, which is verbal abuse. And there can be signs of manipulation, there can be things around control. And what I tend to see quite often is this triangulation with parents. And what I mean by that is where basically the siblings are kind of being pitted against each other. And so you might have, for example, a golden child. So the child who is a high achiever, the child who can do no wrong, always, doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing, like the version of quote unquote the good child, right? And then against the other child who might be seen as like the so-called black sheep of the family. So the person who is non-conformist, the person who might not be as, intellectually smart, for example. They might not be as studious or as academic as their sibling, or they might just have strengths in other areas. But what can happen is that there's almost like this competitiveness that can happen between the siblings. And instead of the parents actually trying to manage that somehow by making sure that the siblings have a good relationship, have a healthy relationship, and focus on more like connection and healthy relationships, they actually pit them against each other by comparing, for example, sometimes in a lot of instances, prioritizing one child or possibly having more of like a favorite child, and not really doing that in a way where it's hidden, where it's like really obvious. They might not say it overtly and say, yeah, that's my favorite child. But as a kid growing up, or, even as an adult, if you're in a family where you're not the favorite, or you know who the favorite is, like it's just obvious, right? You can kind of tell just by how they might get more things than you do. They might get more gifts. They might be celebrated more. They may be contacted more. They may be on the phone to them more. They just put in more effort with the other person, right? You might be the favorite child. You might be the golden child. So you might get a lot more of the praise. You might get a lot more of the attention and the positive focus. And you might always be given the benefit of the doubt that perhaps your sibling, who is perceived as, the black sheep — I don't really like that term, black sheep. What's another term that I can think of? The scapegoat. That's the one. I would much rather use that term. So the scapegoat. So the scapegoat is basically just not given the same amount of love and attention. Sometimes you can be gaslighted by that, gaslighted by your family, gaslighted by your parents, where they won't even admit out loud or to you that actually, yeah, they do have a favorite. And so this feeling that you have of not feeling good enough, or always being compared to, or just never feeling as though you're appreciated and you're accepted and loved in the same way as your sibling. You can kind of pick up on that, but nobody else is acknowledging it. So it almost makes you feel as though you're going crazy, or you might be overreacting, or that you're just overly sensitive. And in that scenario, it's almost minimizing your emotions around it as well, because it's acting as though it's not there and it's all in your head. And I've had many instances with clients where they've had difficult relationships with their siblings. And when we've started to unpack the root of it and where it all comes from and why that dynamic is there, it always comes back to the parents and how the parents have managed the relationship, and the fact that they haven't managed the relationship. They haven't tried to nurture the siblings' relationship so that they can be close. They've almost allowed space for there to be this competitiveness between them instead of closeness and bonding. They've almost enjoyed, sometimes unconsciously, sometimes very consciously, because for whatever reason, it fits in maybe with their cultural beliefs, maybe their values, and maybe because they just themselves haven't done the work. And so the dysfunctional patterns that they've picked up from their own family of origin, they just bring into their own families because they don't really think about doing anything different. They're not on that kind of change. They might be wanting to have better status, for example, but the emotional well-being side just might not be a priority for them. And so sometimes parental neglect or abuse, it creates this competition for love and attention and also survival. And so that's what creates this really hostile dynamic between the siblings, because they are just pitting for that acceptance and love from their parents. And if they don't feel like they get it, or they have to almost tear the other person down in order for them to get it, that's where it breeds a lot of these problematic behaviours. And so siblings can carry these unhealed generational trauma patterns by acting it out with each other. And then this all relates back to attachment, because essentially attachment is about safety seeking in our relationships. And if we don't have our earliest relationships where we feel safe, secure, and loved, and that doesn't mean that we have to receive that 100% of the time, but we just need to receive it enough for us to feel safe, wanted, and cared for. And if in that scenario we have a dysfunctional pattern with our own sibling, that's an early form of attachment trauma, because it's in our earliest family relationships where we learn how to have healthy attachments in our relationships. It's where we learn about safety. And if that's already lacking in our very earliest dynamic, then we're also potentially going to take that out into our other relationships, into adulthood, when we're not addressing or dealing with our traumas. In our family of origin, that's supposed to be our place of safety. That's our place where we're supposed to grow and thrive. And we're supposed to do that in an environment that isn't emotionally, physically, or verbally abusive. It sets off all of our fight or flight responses, and it dysregulates our nervous systems because we are in an environment where we don't feel safe. And if we don't feel safe, then we're constantly on the lookout for signs of danger. We're constantly on the lookout for, okay, when is the next verbal or physical attack going to come? Similar to when we experience harm from our parents, it's the same kind of thing that if we experience that from our siblings, it's the deepest level of betrayal and hurt, because it shapes your identity. It shakes your sense of self. It shakes your feeling of safety and feeling of belonging. So if you did actually speak up about the harm you received from your sibling and it was minimized or you wasn't believed, then it's almost like double the trauma, because you've actually experienced the traumatic thing, the traumatic event, but then it's also about how the traumatic event was dealt with. And if it wasn't dealt with and you wasn't believed and you wasn't protected, it's twice the amount of trauma. And a lot of the time, the trauma isn't just about the event itself that happened. It's also about how the traumatic event was dealt with after the fact. And if you don't receive the kind of protection that you should receive, such as boundaries or consequences for you being harmed, then how are you supposed to trust the people who are supposed to be your protectors? And if you can't trust your family and the people who are supposed to protect you, what does that then do to your ability to trust people outside of family? That must make it very hard for you to be able to trust people outside of your family, because you can't even trust the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally. So it can potentially make you very wary of other people and other relationships, and it can make it very hard for you to trust and for you to let your guard down. So in honor of that previous post that I spoke about at the beginning of the episode that went viral in regards to toxic siblings, which was also the inspiration for this episode, I will just give you a quick rundown of some signs that you might have a toxic sibling. They make everything about them and they have no accountability for the things that they do. They have a real lack of self-awareness and they often take more than what they give. They tend to perceive themselves as the victim, so they think the world and everyone around them is actually against them. They can be physically, emotionally, and verbally abusive. And emotional abuse will come under the umbrella of manipulation, of gaslighting, of guilt tripping. And I don't mean that these things happen a few times over the period of growing up. I'm talking about this is something that happens quite consistently in the family dynamic. You are constantly made to feel as though you are in the wrong, and they can behave as outrageously as they want, shout at you, curse at you, get abusive, and basically you're just supposed to sit back and take it. And then if you do respond and your response is to kind of meet them with that same energy, then you're painted out as the bad guy. They automatically become the person who is the victim. And we almost get this drama triangle. And the drama triangle is like a relational dynamic that can happen especially in dysfunctional family patterns, where you'll have one person in the role of the persecutor, another person in the role of the victim, and the other person in the role of the rescuer. And this is a typical family dynamic when there is toxic behaviors involved. And this relates back to when I was talking about triangulation and the pattern that can sometimes happen in families. So if you have one sibling, for example, who is the aggressor, they would be considered as being in the role of the persecutor. And then you on the receiving end in that scenario could be positioned in the role of the victim. And then the person in the role of the rescuer is often the parent. But what can happen in an unhealthy dynamic and situation where there is triangulation is that even though the sibling who is the one causing a lot of the conflict, the person who is almost like the instigator and originally is in the role of the persecutor, because they are also like the golden child, the parent as the role of the rescuer almost treats them as though they are the victim, which then pushes you into the role of the persecutor because you're the person who is almost calling out the bullshit, calling out the bad behavior. And it messes with the roles within the family system, because when there is a toxic family system, everybody has a role to play. And so when people start to try and step out of that role, it's almost like people will drag you back to that place. So even if you try to set boundaries, even if you try to be the bigger person, because these family roles are so ingrained, it makes it difficult because everyone's like, no. Know your role, know your place. This is how we deal with this dynamic. And so it makes it very hard to step out of that pattern, especially when there's no self-awareness and you haven't done any healing work and you haven't worked on your boundary setting. So I've referenced this TikTok post quite a few times. So what I'm going to try and do is actually link to the post itself so that you can actually go and watch it. It's a really short clip and it was done so off the cuff, like I really didn't even think about it. I recorded it in 30 seconds. My hair's a mess. It was on a very hot heat wave summer day, one of those rare days in England. And it blew up unexpectedly. But the reason why I'm going to link it is because if you're identifying with a lot of this, you might find it really useful to go through and read the comments, because sometimes the comments is like where it's at. If you're someone who uses TikTok, then you already know the comments is where it's popping off, right? And so you might find just a little bit more validation and a little bit more understanding through reading the comments. But one of the things that kind of sticks out for me is just remembering that some people actually felt quite worried that they were in fact the toxic sibling. And maybe you have that response listening to this, thinking, oh shit, is that me? I feel like you're calling me out right now. And it's not to come from a place of blame or judgment. It's to come from a place of understanding what part we play in this family drama, what part we play within the family roles, because we can't change what we don't know. And if we understand a little bit more about how we're showing up in our families, that's a really good place to be, because that's coming from a place of empowerment and change. And the reality is, at some point or another, we've all been a little bit toxic, right? And so having toxic behaviors doesn't necessarily make us toxic. So I don't want you to label like normal sibling rivalry or normal complicated relationships as, oh, that means that me or my sibling has to be the toxic one. It's not about pointing fingers to see like who is toxic. And I think it's much better to have more of a self-awareness of our own part in a lot of this, rather than shaming others or even shaming ourselves, because we can't learn and heal and grow if we are coming from a position of shame. One of the most fundamental parts of there being like a narcissistic personality type or a toxic sibling is the fact that there will be somebody or some people within the family who enable the toxic behavior, because the toxic behavior can only exist if it's being accepted and being enabled by the family around you. And if there are no boundaries being set, if there are no consequences, if there's no validation of what the behavior is, then it does continue and it does breed and it does get worse. But being able to heal from having family trauma as a result of toxic siblings, it starts with actually being able to name your experience and validate that for yourself. And it's reclaiming your right to be able to actually set boundaries with your family. Yes, even with family, like family and boundaries have to go hand in hand together. And it doesn't mean that you are betraying the family. It doesn't mean that you are being disrespectful of the family. Boundaries are a key part of what is missing, especially when it comes to experiencing trauma. Boundaries are what keeps us safe in relationships. It's what helps us to be in relationship with somebody else. It's showing somebody how we expect to be treated and how we would want to be loved. And it's about what we will and won't accept. And we can't make exceptions to that just in the name of family and DNA. If anything, with family, we have to lovingly set boundaries even more, because we are so committed to maintaining relationships, and it's much harder to cut family members off, for example. And I never advocate for just cutting family off unless there are serious concerns around issues of safety. Healing in this environment has to come from a place of, how can you start to set boundaries? And the thing is, with boundary setting, which I go through with my clients quite often, well, very often, it's also very dependent on values. It's also dependent on cultural beliefs. And so when we are setting boundaries, we don't want to do it from this lens of, say, just westernized culture of cut them off, individualization, we don't need anybody. Family is a very important part of our identity. And I know not everybody feels that way, because again, it depends on your culture, it depends on your values. But for many of us, our families are tied in with so much of who we are. And so just cutting people off or setting very hard, rigid boundaries just won't work. So we have to find a happy medium of how can we still be respectful of values and culture, but how do we also protect ourselves and keep ourselves safe so that we can be in connection with people in our family and feel safe around them and feel loving towards them and not just having to tolerate them because of blood. Sometimes healing can look like perhaps going no contact in very extreme circumstances, or perhaps having lower contact. And maybe having lower contact is a way that you kind of manage and cope with the guilt. And it might be that you work on your self-trust and your relationships outside of the family if it doesn't feel like you can do that safely, or you can do that in a way that aligns with your own values, because we don't always have the same values as our family of origin. In fact, I think it's really important that we actually pay attention to what is our own beliefs and values, what comes from our own belief systems, and what's the stuff that we've been conditioned to believing. And you can also totally choose to just not repeat the same toxic dynamics that you grew up with in your own family. So if you consider yourself as possibly the toxic sibling, then start thinking about, well, what can I do to change that? What can I do to own my part in this? And how can I do things differently so that I'm not projecting my own wounds and my own insecurities on my siblings? And how do I break this pattern starting with me? And you might be the cycle breaker, or you might realize that you've been the person who has been showing up as a version of yourself that you're not particularly proud of. Either way, there is always the potential for healing, and there's always the potential to do something different. I hope this can be validating in acknowledging that sibling trauma is very real, and it can be just as harmful and cause those attachment wounds just as much as from your parents. I do so much work around dysfunctional patterns in family, and if you are based in the EU and the UK, I am actually accepting clients right now, so I will leave a link in the show notes. So if you are thinking about either starting therapy or you just want to have a chat to see if we could be a good fit to work together, I suggest that you book a 15-minute intro call and we'll see if we are a good fit. And if not, I'm always happy to point you in the right direction. Speak to you soon. Thank you for joining this episode of Healing Childhood Trauma. I hope you found today's discussion insightful and empowering. Remember, healing is a journey and you are not alone on this path. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on your favourite podcast platform. And you can share this episode with a friend. Your feedback helps this podcast to reach more women who are ready to heal and build secure, healthy relationships and heal from the past.